Hello everyone, my name is Muhammad Nur Habib and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Physiotherapy in University of Science and Technology, Meghalaya. So in today's lecture, we'll be discussing about ascariasis. Now what's ascariasis? It is a disease that is caused by the parasite Ascaris lumbricoides. Now before studying about Ascaris lumbricoides, let's discuss a little bit about what is a parasite. Now, a parasite is a living organism that is dependent on another living organism for its survival. Now, they derive all the nutritions from host organisms without giving any benefit to the host organism. Okay. Now, parasite can be broadly classified into two categories. That is the unicellular protozoas and the multicellular helminths. The protozoa are further subclassified into three groups. That is the amoeba, flagellate, and sporozoa. And in case of the helminths, they're subclassified into cystod, trematodes, and nematodes. Now, here we will be discussing about Ascaris, and Ascaris comes under the category of nematodes. So it shares all the characteristics of the nematodes. Okay, let's move on. Now, Ascaris lumbricoides, it is commonly known as the roundworm. It is the natural habitat of this worm is the jejunum region of the small intestine, and it is the largest nematode that parasites the human intestine. The name Ascaris lumbricoides has been derived from the Latin words ascaris, which means intestinal worm, and lumbricus, which means that it resembles the common earthworm. Hence, it got this name from there. Now, it has a worldwide distribution, specifically in the tropical countries like India and other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Thailand. Now they are dioecious. Now it is a very important characteristic of the nematodes. Dioecious. Now what are dioecious? Dioecious are organisms that have separate sexes, like separate male organisms and separate female organisms. Okay. And the lifespan of an adult Ascaris lumbricoides worm is 1 to 2 years. Okay. Now moving on, let's briefly look into the morphology of the worm. Here, now they are round or cylindrical in shape with tapering ends. Now what do you mean by tapering ends? Now from this diagram, we can understand that at the end, it is getting more narrower. So that is what tapering ends means. Like in the end, it gets narrow. They have a highly developed organ system in case of nematodes. They have a mouth, they have all the organs, and they have a anus. That is, they have two openings. The mouth, it is situated anteriorly, and it has three characteristic toothed lips. One of them are situated ventrally, dorsally, and two of them are situated ventrally. And in this diagram, we can see that the organs inside the worm are floating in some kind of fluid. Now, this is the body cavity, and this fluid is known as ascaron or ascarides, and this fluid is an irritant in nature. So if this fluid is somehow leaked in the body, it may lead to an allergic reactions. And all the organs, they float in this fluid. Okay. Now moving on. Okay. Now, as we have discussed that the organism, that the Ascaris is dioecious, that they have separate male and female organisms. Now, let's look a little bit on the morphology of these organisms. Now, the diagram in the center, if we look at the diagram that in the A section, we can see that there are two worms. That the female worm is longer or bigger in size compared to the male worm. That is typically the characteristic of a nematode, where the female is larger compared to the male. Generally, the female is 20 to 25 centimeters in 25 to 40 centimeters. I'm sorry, 25 to 40 centimeters in length compared to just 15 to 30 centimeters in case of males. And also in diameters, they are 5 millimeter in diameter for female, and male have only 2 to 4 millimeters in diameters. And now we can see that the female worm is straight. They are posteriorly straight, and in case of the male worm, the end is curved ventrally in the form of a hook, and it has two copulatory spicles. Now, what are they? What are their functions? Their function is that they help in reproduction. They help in mating. And if we look at the mating region, in the female, the vulva is situated anteriorly in the middle portion, in the middle third portion of the body, and there is a junction called the vulval waist. And in the valvular waste, what happens? Here the reproduction occurs, and ultimately, uh, here in the section C, in the EC image, we can see that there is an anal opening that is in the lower part of the worm, in the posterior region, where through which the female worms lays egg. Now they lay enormous amount of egg, that is around 200,000 per day. Now they can survive for 1 to 2 years. So just imagine the number of eggs, the amount of eggs they lay in by amount of eggs that are laid by one single worm. Okay, if you look more in the morphology, we can see that in the B diagram, there are the two-toed leaves that I mentioned earlier. They have the dorsal leaves, they have the ventricle leaves. One of them is dorsal and two of them are ventricles. Okay. Now moving on to the eggs, let's discover about the eggs. Now these images shows us the eggs of the worm. Now these eggs can be either fertilized or unfertilized. And as we can see that they are brownish in color, this is because these eggs are bipigmented. Now because of this pigment, they are brownish in color. Okay, let's study them in a little bit more detail. Now this is the fertilized egg. Now from the fertilized egg itself, we can understand that this egg has been fertilized. Now they are round or oval in shape. They are measuring around 55 micrometer in diameter, or 55 micrometer in length to 40 micrometer in breadth. They have an outer coat, then outer albuminous coat, and then in the inside we have the germ cell or the embryo here, and between them is a very thick yellow colored chitin shell. This is the shell of the egg. If we look into the unfertilized egg, now sometimes what happens is the female worm doesn't get fertilized, but it still lays egg. Now these eggs are unfertilized egg. This happens when there is an absence of the male worm. In the absence of male worm, the female still lays egg, but these eggs are unfertilized. Now, if we look in the structure of the eggs, they are more narrower and longer compared to the fertilized egg. Their length is around 90 micrometers and their breadth is around 40 micrometers. They have a very heavy, irregular cord, albuminous cord, and very thinner. The chitin layer here is very thin. And as the egg doesn't fertilize here, it forms amorphous mass of protoplasm. It just gets wasted away in this case. Okay. Okay, now let's see a bit about the prevalence and transmission of Ascaris. Now, they are mostly found in the rural population of the tropical and subtropical areas. Now, why in the rural population? Because the most important way that the Ascaris is transmitted is through the human feces. That is how they get this. They come out of the body in the form of eggs. Now, when the soil is contaminated with this human feces and food is grown in this contaminated soil, ultimately the food gets contaminated. And when we ingest this contaminated food, we are injecting the eggs of the worm. Okay, so hence ultimately, what happens is the person gets infected and he may come up with a disease. Okay. Now let's move on to the life cycle here. Okay. From the life cycle, as we have discussed, that the jejunum is the normal habitat of the worm, and it lays eggs, a large number of eggs, and these eggs are passed through the feces of the human feces, and ultimately to the soil. Now we have to understand that only the fertilized eggs are infective, and they're not directly infective. They have to go on a period of incubation and get converted into an embryonic egg. From the life cycle, we can see that it takes around 10 to 40 days for development, and it sheds and it forms a larva inside it. That is the labrigiform larva. In this stage, they are also known as the embryonated egg. Now, when a person injects this embryonated egg through contaminated food or contaminated water, they come up with the infections or with the eggs, and these eggs go to the intestine and through the stomach to the intestine. And after that, what happens? They shed the outer shell, and the larva comes out of the egg. And these larvae, they are motile. And then they penetrate the mucous membrane, and with the help of the blood circulation, they move on to the liver. From the liver, they stay there for 3 to 4 days, and they go another stage of molting. Now, from there, they go. Okay, Now, what happens after that is that from the liver, they go on to the lungs through heart, and in the lungs, they go further development. Now, after this development, what happens is that they penetrate the capillary walls and then they move into the alveolar region of the lungs. Now, from this, they travel through the bronchus to the trachea, and then they are propelled to the larynx and pharynx. From there, they are swallowed back into the stomach, and then ultimately they reach the small intestine, which is their normal habitat. Okay. Now they stay there for around 6 to 10 weeks. After that, they acquire sexual maturity, and by the 12th week, the female eggs starts laying the egg, and these eggs are again passed through the feces. Hence, the cycle continues. Okay. Now this is now in this cycle in this image we can understand what are the main organs that are involved in the life cycle. Here we can see that when contaminated food, the embryonated egg is eaten or ingested, they go into the intestine. Now from there they go to the lungs where they get developed, and then they move to they are swallowed back. They try to move to the trachea and the pharynx, and then they get swallowed back, and then they ultimately reach the stomach, then the intestine again. And then from the intestine, the non-infected form of the egg are excreted again. Okay. Let's discuss about the symptoms and complications of scaries. Now, the most common symptom is abdominal pain, which is the most common symptom of any parasitic infection. Then we have coughing. Coughing or gagging, as this is due to the result of worms blocking the windpipe or the intestinal tract. And the most important complication is malnourishment and impaired growth. Now, these are observed in chronic cases when the case is very severe, and they are mostly observed in children. Okay. Moving on to the diagnostics portion. Now, the most important diagnostic method here is stool examination. We try to go for microscopic examination of the stool, and then we try to detect the eggs, or in some cases, we even detect the adult larva or adult worm in the eggs under the microscope. We try to detect them. There are various methods. We can observe them with KOH mount or IoT mount, or there are concentrated methods like flotation methods or sedimentation methods. These methods are very important because they give us a more accurate result. X-rays can also be done for the detection purposes, especially in case of children. And endoscopy is another method. They can be used for detection. Also, they can also be used for removing of these worms during the procedure. Moving on to the treatment now. Treatment and prevention. As we all know, prevention is better than cure. So what will be the prevention in this case? In any parasitic case, the most important treatment prevention is hygiene. To maintain a proper hygiene, we should wash our hands regularly with soap. We should cook our food at a very high temperature so that if there are any worms or egg present, they get killed off or they get destroyed. We should properly dispose our human feces. This is one of the most important points. The human feces, especially if the person is infected, the feces should be disposed of very properly, and these feces should be avoided to be used as a human fertilizer. Okay. Now, if the person is infected, what will be the treatments? Treatments are anti-helminth drugs or anti-parasitic drugs like albendazole and mebendazole. These drugs are very effective in elimination of the worms as well as the eggs. It is suggested that person should take these drugs after every 6 months, if not 6 months, at least once in a year. Okay, with this, I will be ending today's lecture. Okay. Thank you, everyone.